The hallway of Elegance restaurant crackled with tension. Kevin Torres, the arrogant manager, cornered Natasha Williams, a young black waitress, his voice dripping with venom. "You insolent little black girl," he sneered, slamming a hand against the wall. He threatened her for rejecting a senator's $5,000 bribe, unaware that Natasha's calm silence hid a secret. Her phone was recording every word. Just as he leaned closer, a deep, commanding voice cut through the chaos. A man in a dark suit stepped forward, his presence enough to still the air. It was Alessandro Moretti, Natasha's husband, and Kevin's nightmare. Natasha Williams had always been the kind of woman people underestimated, and that was precisely her strength. With an MBA from Howard University and fluency in 3 languages, she could have been sitting behind a glass office wall, managing million-dollar portfolios. But instead, she tied her apron each morning, smiled politely at customers who rarely met her eyes, and worked 12-hour shifts at Elegance, one of Chicago's most prestigious restaurants. To most, she was just another waitress trying to make ends meet. But the truth was far more dangerous and far more deliberate. 2 years earlier, Natasha had overheard her husband, Alessandro Moretti, discussing a growing concern. Politicians, businessmen, and judges frequently dined at Elegance, often settling private matters in back rooms. Money changed hands. Deals were whispered over wine. It was the kind of corruption that didn't leave a paper trail, only subtle exchanges and coded conversations. Alessandro suspected the restaurant was part of a larger laundering network for bribes, political favors, and fraudulent contracts. But to prove it, someone had to get close. Someone invisible. And Natasha volunteered. Her friends thought she'd lost her mind. "You're overqualified," they told her. "You'll be wasting your potential." But Natasha understood something they didn't. Power hides in plain sight. The elite never fear the people they consider beneath them, and that blindness was the perfect camouflage. So she put away her pearls, stripped her resume of any trace of her degrees, and applied for a minimum wage job as a server. When Kevin Torres, the restaurant manager, hired her, he smirked at her handshake and said, "Welcome to the team, sweetheart. Try not to mess up like the last one." That was her first glimpse of the contempt that ran through the walls of Elegance like poison. In the beginning, the insults were easy to ignore. Kevin would bark orders at her in front of guests, make comments about her skin tone when assigning tables, and call her girl instead of her name. The other staff followed his lead, some out of fear, others out of habit. Still, Natasha never flinched. Every time someone mocked her or dismissed her, she filed it away, not in anger, but in evidence. Each humiliation became a quiet piece of a much larger puzzle she was assembling. Hidden inside her server notebook was a tiny voice recorder. The pen clipped to her apron contained a miniature camera. Each night, when she returned home, she'd upload the footage to a secure drive Alessandro had set up. Together, they analyzed transactions, staff schedules, and guest lists. Over time, a disturbing pattern emerged. Certain politicians dined there before every major policy decision, judges after controversial verdicts, and lobbyists during city budget discussions. Elegance wasn't just a restaurant. It was the beating heart of corruption disguised as fine dining. There were moments when the weight of it all nearly broke her. She watched innocent employees get fired for mistakes they didn't make, saw young servers reduced to tears by Kevin's temper, and witnessed backroom deals where cash was exchanged in envelopes thicker than dinner menus. But Natasha's calm never cracked. She smiled, served, and endured, because patience was her greatest weapon. She knew that when you're fighting power this big, you don't win by shouting. You win by outsmarting. Late one evening, after closing, she stood alone in the kitchen, wiping down a counter that gleamed with false perfection. The sound of laughter drifted from the private dining room, politicians celebrating another successful deal. Natasha turned off the lights, took a deep breath, and whispered to herself, They think I'm invisible. Let's keep it that way. She didn't know it yet, but that quiet moment marked the turning point. By the end of her second year, she had recorded hundreds of hours of conversations, documented every illegal transaction she witnessed, and traced connections between senators, judges, and businessmen across state lines. Alessandro warned her to be careful. One wrong move could expose everything. But Natasha only smiled. "They don't see me, Alessandro. That's what makes me powerful." And she was right, because while Kevin Torres strutted through the restaurant, flaunting his authority and belittling his staff, Natasha was quietly building the case that would end him, and everyone who thought her silence meant weakness. Kevin Torres had always believed fear kept his world in order. It was his favorite management tool, a smirk here, a threat there, and suddenly everyone fell in line. But that morning, something about Natasha's calm unnerved him. She wasn't trembling when he barked her name. She didn't rush to apologize when he accused her of disrespecting a VIP. Instead, she simply looked at him with steady eyes, quiet, unflinching, unreadable. And that silence made him furious. He slammed the office door behind them, the sound echoing through the kitchen. "You think you can embarrass me in front of a senator?" He spat, pacing like a predator. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with, girl?" Natasha's hands were folded neatly in front of her apron. "I do," she said softly. "And you don't want to do what you're about to do." Her tone wasn't defiant. It was calm, almost warning. That made Kevin angrier. He grabbed her arm, leaning close enough that she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You think your little attitude's cute? I can make one phone call and you'll never work in this city again." His voice was dripping with arrogance, the same arrogance he'd used to destroy others before her. But this time, he wasn't facing a frightened employee. He was staring into the eyes of someone who had already decided his fate. "I'm sure you could," Natasha replied quietly. "But first, you might want to answer a question." She reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and tapped the screen. Suddenly, the office filled with Kevin's own voice, a recording of him from 2 nights earlier, slurring insults at her during a late shift. "You people should be grateful we even let you serve here." Kevin froze. The blood drained from his face as he realized what he was hearing. How did you—" he stammered. Natasha tilted her head slightly. "You've said a lot of things, Kevin. To me, to others. I just thought it might be useful to keep track." He lunged forward to snatch the phone, but before he could reach her, the office door opened. The noise from the dining room faded instantly, replaced by a suffocating silence. Standing in the doorway was a tall man in a charcoal suit, his expression unreadable. Kevin straightened up instinctively, unsure whether to feel threatened or safe. "And you are?" he demanded. Alessandro Moretti stepped inside, his voice cool and even. "The husband of the woman you just tried to assault," he said. There was no shouting, no aggression, only control, the kind of power that didn't need to raise its tone. Kevin tried to laugh it off. "Oh, this is cute. The hero husband comes to the rescue of his little waitress." But Alessandro didn't flinch. He placed a file on the desk between them and opened it. Inside were photographs, stacks of cash being exchanged in the restaurant's private lounge, emails showing falsified invoices, and a copy of a recorded bribe between Kevin and Senator Richardson. Kevin's smirk vanished. "What is this?" he whispered. "This," Alessandro said, "is the summary of your last 2 years of business, or what the FBI will soon call evidence." Kevin stumbled back, shaking his head. "You're bluffing. None of that can be proven." Natasha finally spoke again, her voice soft, but deadly clear. "You think you hired a waitress, Kevin?" She took a step closer, meeting his panicked eyes. "You actually hired your own investigator." The words hit harder than a slap. Kevin stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. The woman he'd mocked, insulted, and threatened wasn't some powerless employee. She was the reason the walls around him were beginning to close in. Alessandro continued, his tone unchanging. For months, Natasha has been sending copies of every illegal transaction, every recorded conversation to federal authorities. Operation Clean Plate, that's what they're calling it. You're at the center of it. Kevin tried to speak but couldn't. His throat was dry, his hands trembling. He looked at Natasha again, this time not with anger, but with something closer to fear. "You set me up," he muttered. "No," she corrected. "You set yourself up. I just made sure there was proof." The silence that followed was deafening. Kevin sank into his chair, sweat glistening on his forehead. Everything he'd built, the reputation, the control, the illusion of superiority, was unraveling right in front of him, and the woman he had treated as invisible was the one pulling every thread. Natasha stepped closer to the desk, her voice still calm. "You once told me I'd never be more than a server," she said. "Turns out, serving justice pays better." For a moment, Alessandro's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then looked at Kevin. "That was the Bureau," he said quietly. "They're on their way." Kevin shot up from his chair. "Wait, please. We can talk about this. There's money, I can—" Natasha raised her hand to stop him. "Save your breath. You've been talking for 2 years, Kevin. Now it's time you finally listen." And for the first time in his life, Kevin Torres didn't have a single word left. Kevin's mind raced as the walls of his office seemed to close in around him. His breath came short, chest tightening with a panic he couldn't hide. Natasha stood still, arms folded, her calmness sharper than any anger could have been. The way she looked at him, not with hatred but with cold precision, made him realize how little power he truly had. Alessandro opened the file again, flipping through neatly labeled folders. Transactions, wire transfers, political donations. Each tab was a nail in Kevin's professional coffin. Natasha took one folder, placed it on the desk, and began to speak as if she were presenting a case in court. "For 24 months, she said steadily, "I've been documenting everything that happened inside this restaurant. Every payment that didn't match the receipts, every bribe disguised as a special catering fee. Every donation that left here in unmarked envelopes. You thought you were running a restaurant, Kevin. You were actually running a criminal pipeline." Kevin blinked, unable to process her words. "You're lying," he croaked. "You can't have proof of all that." Natasha didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek flash drive. 43 recordings. She began, counting on her fingers, 27 photographs and 62 written reports, all submitted to the federal authorities every single week. "Do you want to know what I called my weekly emails?" She leaned forward, her tone almost conversational. "Menu specials. You'd be amazed how much crime fits into a dinner reservation." Kevin's jaw tightened. "You were spying on me." "No," she said simply. "I was documenting the truth. You made it easy. You bragged about every deal you brokered, every senator you greased. You even used your office phone to negotiate bribes. Did you really think no one was listening?" Kevin's voice broke into a desperate laugh. "You expect me to believe the FBI cares about some waitress?" Alessandro smirked slightly. "She's not just some waitress. Natasha holds an MBA, a background in financial forensics, and a working relationship with the Bureau. They've been in on this from day one." Kevin's face went pale. He staggered back, gripping the edge of the desk. "No. No, that can't be." Natasha slid another photo across the desk, a still frame of Senator Richardson handing Kevin an envelope during a late-night dinner. "Do you recognize this?" she asked. Kevin's stomach dropped. He remembered that night clearly. The senator had promised a $5,000 tip for expedited paperwork. He thought it was just another quiet exchange, something they'd done dozens of times before. But the photo told a different story. 3 camera angles, time-stamped, crystal clear. That meeting, Natasha continued, wasn't a private deal. It was a sting operation. There were 3 hidden cameras in the chandelier and 2 federal witnesses sitting at the next table. You didn't know because one was disguised as a food critic and the other as a busboy. Every word you said is on record. Kevin's legs gave out and he collapsed into his chair. His hands trembled violently. "You set me up," he whispered. "No, Kevin," Alessandro said coolly. "You set yourself up the moment you thought you were untouchable." Natasha began to pace slowly, her voice growing quieter but heavier with each sentence. "The Bureau already has everything. The names, the transactions, the offshore accounts. 12 politicians. 8 judges. 15 businessmen. All tied to you in this restaurant. You weren't just laundering money, Kevin. You were the artery of corruption running through half the city's power structure." Kevin's eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape that didn't exist. You don't know what you're doing," he stammered. "You'll ruin lives. Important people, they'll come after you." Natasha stopped pacing and turned to face him fully. "They already tried," she said softly. "Do you remember Marissa, the hostess who suddenly quit?" She didn't quit. She was threatened for talking. The dishwasher who went missing last spring. He reported your fake invoices. He's in protective custody now. Each word cut deeper than the last. Kevin felt his knees shaking, sweat dripping down his temple. The room was spinning. Not because of fear alone, but because everything Natasha said made horrifying sense. She wasn't bluffing. This was real. He tried to steady himself, grasping at whatever authority he thought he still had. "Maybe we can make a deal," he blurted. "I have connections. I can help you." Natasha raised a hand to silence him. "The time for deals ended when you laid hands on me," she said. Her tone was still composed, but there was a quiet finality in it, the voice of someone who had already won. Kevin's desperation grew. "Please," he begged. "Just tell them it was a misunderstanding. I can make things right." Alessandro interjected, his voice as cold as steel. "You've spent years breaking people, Kevin. Years using fear to control them. Now, for the first time, you're the one afraid. And you should be. The Bureau isn't coming for a misunderstanding. They're coming for a conspiracy." Kevin slumped back, tears beginning to well in his eyes. The bravado, the arrogance, the smirking cruelty, all of it was gone. He looked like a man stripped bare, seeing the ruins of his empire for the first time. Natasha moved toward the window, watching the city lights flicker against the evening sky. "Do you know what's ironic?" she said quietly, almost to herself. "I used to pray someone would expose what was happening here. Then I realized, sometimes the only person willing to step into the darkness is the one the world ignores." She turned back to him. "You ignored me, Kevin, and that's exactly how I was able to destroy you." The words hung in the air like a verdict. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded louder now, each second dragging Kevin closer to the inevitable. He buried his face in his hands, shaking. "They'll ruin me," he murmured. Natasha took a final step closer, her voice a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through his despair. "No, Kevin, you ruined yourself. I just turned the lights on." The office door opened again, and the sound of approaching sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Kevin looked up, the realization dawning too late that everything he'd built on greed and hate was about to collapse. Natasha exchanged a look with Alessandro, her expression calm, resolute. "It's time," she said softly. And as the flashing red and blue lights reflected through the window, Kevin Torres finally understood the cost of underestimating the woman he once called just a waitress. The silence in Kevin's office was shattered by the distant wail of sirens. They grew louder with each passing second, a sound that made Kevin's heart pound in terror but made Natasha's lips curve in quiet relief. The walls that had once echoed with his orders, insults, and self-importance were about to witness justice for the first time. A fleet of black SUVs screeched to a halt in front of Elegance. The elegant restaurant that once hosted senators, judges, and billionaires now looked like the scene of a crime, because that's exactly what it was. Within seconds, the glass doors burst open. FBI agents in Navy windbreakers flooded inside, their voices sharp and commanding. "Federal agents, step away from the counters, hands where we can see them!" Waiters froze mid-step, trays clattering to the floor. Diners looked around in horror, confused by the chaos erupting around them. A few tried to slip toward the exits, but agents were already blocking every door. Cameras from nearby news vans began flashing through the windows. The whispers started almost immediately. "What's going on? Is this a raid? They're arresting someone important." Kevin stumbled toward the window, staring in disbelief as armed agents poured into his restaurant, his kingdom, where he had ruled for years with cruelty and unchecked arrogance. "No," he muttered. "No, this can't be happening." But it was. Alessandro stood calmly by the office door, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. Natasha, standing beside him, didn't flinch. Her eyes were steady as she watched the agents fan out across the dining room. She'd spent 2 years gathering evidence for this moment. Every insult she endured, every night she went home exhausted and humiliated, every silent tear shed in the back hallway, all of it led here. "Kevin Torres!" a voice boomed from the restaurant floor. "You're under arrest for money laundering, tax evasion, racial discrimination, and conspiracy to commit fraud." The words echoed like thunder. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A senator who had been dining in the corner quietly pushed away his plate, face pale. 2 judges exchanged terrified glances. They knew the web was bigger than Kevin, and if he fell, they might fall too. Kevin's knees nearly buckled as 2 agents approached him. "You have the right to remain silent," one of them recited, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." He tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. "There's been a mistake," he choked out. I can explain." But Natasha stepped forward, her calm voice cutting through his panic. "You don't need to explain, Kevin. You already did. I have your words saved on 43 separate recordings.